And it's finally done. It took me some months to complete it, but here is the base that will serve as a showcase for the Vespid 7-second scale Jagdpanther and the 3 figures that I made from scratch. So take a seat and grab some coffee while I walk you through the whole process of building and painting it. Well, all started with a rectangular piece of ordinary styrofoam that I added some balsa wood stripes on the sides. The base measures around 14.3 by 12.5 centimeters and will accommodate the tank, an old stone shed section, some greenery and a small pigsty. Using a hot wire cutter and an improvised wood jig, I cut the shed size from Diorama. The shed core was made from styrofoam, cut to fit the corner of the base, and then using a vegetal paper to get the right footprint of it. Cutting the Diorama wall edges in 45 degrees angle to get a nice 90 degree fitting between the walls was quite difficult with the tools I have available. So to get around this problem, I decided to cut a dent on one of the walls, just the length to fit the other wall's thickness, leaving only the thin paper layer to cover the sides of the second Diorama wall. The explanation maybe got a little confused, but I guess the video talks by itself. After several failed attempts to cut the Diorama in 45 degrees angle, I think this way was much easier to control and the result was quite good. Then I glued the Diorama walls on the styrofoam core using PVA glue, and after it dried I cut the excess styrofoam with the hot wire cutter and the improvised jig. With a solid shed structure, it was time to engrave some textures on it. I started by drawing a stone wall with 0.5 mm mechanic pencil. Putting some pressure while drawing, I can tear the paper layer between the stones, creating more depth that will be essential for the painting process. I chose to make an irregular stone wall not only because I was lazy, believe it or not, but this base will depict a rural area. So after looking for some pictures of 1944, I saw many structures built with irregular stones and decided to go on this way. I also wanted to give an almost abandoned appeal to the shed, so I removed some stones here and there with the tweezers. To increase texture and irregularity of the walls, I rolled an aluminum foil ball on the walls and then pushed some individual stones with a silicone paintbrush. Moving to the roof, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible, so I marked the battens on the styrofoam roof and then carved them with a hobby blade. These engraved lines serve to hold the battens in place and roughly on the same level as the styrofoam. I cut the battens from balsa wood and glued them in place with PVA glue. Then I cut the excess with a side cutter, flush on the base sides and left a small tip on the wall side. I planned to left some missing and broken tiles, so I dug some holes on the styrofoam, leaving only the batten to be seen. I spent some time looking for tiles, but I didn't find anything that suits what I wanted, so I decided to make my own. I cut thin PSP foam stripes with the hot wire, and then divided them in smaller stripes with 5 mm width. I borrowed the kitchen's glass cutting board, so don't mind the tomatoes art, right? And placed 2 tacky gun noodles and then laid the PSP stripes between them and then interlaced them with the toothpick. After everything was fixed, I quick passed a lighter flame close to the PSP. Not too close of course because this thing is flammable, but just enough for it to deform and keep the new wavy pattern. When you remove the toothpick, you end up with a nice PSP wave. Then it is just a matter of chopping the stripes into small tiles with the hobby blade. This method is a good way to make Spanish-style clay tiles, but I want something a bit different based on this picture. Well, it was quite easy to make what I wanted. I just folded one side of the tile to make the cover lock and then smoothed the pan curve. Just this, super simple, but I had to make hundreds of them, so it took quite a while. Gluing the tiles on place was also a pain, but looking the roof taking shape was very rewarding. The irregularity of the process kind of make it more realistic considering the context of this base. I fixed the shed on the base and covered its sides with balsa wood to give a better finish. I cut excess wood with the hobby blade and sanded the joints to have a smooth surface. Then I added the last tiles, covering the balsa woods, and as a final touch I cut the tiles flush to the base sides. And that's it for the shed. Let's move to the floor. I cut 2mm wide balsa wood to simulate the wood fence poles. I scraped them with a steel brush to give a rough finish and then glued them in place. I wanted to add some kind of drain or creek alongside the road, so I dig a trench on the styrofoam and cut the wood sides to match the trench profile. Moving to the terrain effects. I could use some commercial product, but I really don't have any, so I went with the mix of wood sawdust, sand, water and PVA glue. I'm pretty sure this way demands much more work, but the result is just good as with ready-to-use products. Just need to be more patient. After a thick layer of this homemade terrain, I add some pebbles around the base, followed by layers of coarse and thin dirt. To make the tank tracks marks on the ground, I used a plastic film over the base and pressed the model on it, with a still wet surface. A spare track was used to reinforce the track print, and I also pushed the wet terrain a bit on the model side to give a more natural look to the contact between terrain and the tank. After everything was dry, I added some more coarse pebbles on the road. It is natural to have loose material over dirt roads that are not frequently used, so it fits nicely to what I want. For the pigsty, I had a different approach. I need mud, so I sifted dirt through a super fine mesh, then added water and PVA glue, mixing it until I got this brownie batter consistency. Brownie. I can't resist. Ugh. Sorry about that. Stupid jokes is something stronger than me. Well, back to the pigsty. I spread this deliciously poisoned mix over the pigsty area and a bit over the road to make a smooth transition. And then with a toothpick I poke it to give the appearance of animals moving around. The greenery was made in several steps, starting by adding the base layer of 2mm static grass. I didn't use any applicator on this base, just to sprinkle the grass with my fingers. While the grass was drying, I applied a coat of diluted PVA glue over the pigsty area to seal it and prepare it for the upcoming effects. Then I noticed that I forgot to add one of the fence wood poles. Back to vegetation. I placed some tufts of 6mm grass over the 2mm grass, again with my fingers. At first glance it looks odd, but after it dries I flip the base and clean the excess fibers with a brush, and it gets a whole different look. Vegetation is one thing that dragged me to vignettes and dioramas. I like to make it with different materials and lengths, which definitely makes an eye-catchy base. I made a few tall grass tufts by adding PVA glue spots on a backing paper from an old sticker. When dried, I just plucked the tufts, removed the loose fibers and trimmed it to the desired length. Then it's just a matter of choosing some spots to glue them on the base. I concentrated this high grass around the creek area to balance the base look, as this would be a void spot. To add even more variation, I cut some leaf shapes out of baking paper by first drawing it and later cutting with a swivel knife. I also tried to make large leaves plants by doing the same approach, but it didn't turn out as I was expecting. Maybe the baking paper is too fragile for this matter, and cutting it to the desired shape is quite difficult. Anyway, after cutting them, I just glued them together in different angles. The same was done to the small leaves. After dried, I bent the leaves with the tweezers, to give them a curved shape and a more natural look. The bigger plants didn't go as I was expecting. They looked a little bit odd, but I thought that after painting them, they would look much better, so I decided to move on. I also added some sponges from Woodland Scenics, more specific the underbush and coarse turfs, in some spots that were a bit empty, here and there, to build more vegetation volume, and the greenery was pretty much done so far, at least before painting. As this base is supposed to depict a tank being prepared on an ambush spot, I want to make the crew collecting some branches and vegetation to tie on the tank sides. So some branches were made from twisted copper wire. I applied a thick coat of black superglue to hide the twisted appearance of the copper wire, and also to glue some polyfibers on the twigs. Then I clipped the excess fibers and glued some coarse turf sponges. A second branch type was made in the same way, however instead of polyfiber and sponge I glued only 2mm stacked grass on the twigs. While those branches were drying, I added the last elements before starting the painting process of the base. So I finished the wood fence by adding wooden slats made from balsa wood, clipping them on the base edge, and damaging one of them to give that abandonment look. I also brushed diluted PVA glue on the balsa to eliminate those splinters coming out from the wood, and punched some nail marks with a metal pin. The last touch was the pig feeder, also made from balsa wood, but I didn't record it, so sorry about that. And the base is ready for priming. I started by applying a good coat of Vallejo black over the entire base, but focusing on the shady areas like on the walls and roof holes and under vegetation. Then I picked a bunch of acrylic colors, most of them in earth tones with a bit of gray, and prepared them on my wet palette. I actually didn't need all of these colors because I end up mixing them, but it's good to have plenty of color variation for this step. So, painting the wall is quite fun for me, even though it demands a lot of time to do it. I picked some random stones and painted them with as much color variation as I could. As it is an old stone wall, I think earth tones fit quite nicely. The roof was painted in the same manner, only using more reddish tones. It's important to keep good contrast now, even it looking weird. On next step, this contrast will attenuate and may disappear if you go too soft on this step. To simulate the mortar between the stones, I used plaster mixed with burnt umber and a bit of tap water. The mix don't need to be super homogeneous, as some color variation during application is an unwelcome effect. Then I spread this mix over the walls, but not entirely. I left some areas without it to give the impression of loose stones. After that, I wiped the excess with a napkin and finished it with a brush moisture with tap water. This step works also as a filter. As you can see, the initial contrast is already quite attenuated. On the roof, I only applied a filter made with mahogany and a hint of flat earth. I applied it very diluted and several times to slowly build the effect, taking care to not disappear with the previous contrast. Moving to the wood elements. The fence, the pig feeder and the visible battens on the roof were painted with a first layer of wood color followed by grayish tones, all with wet blending technique. Wood exposed to weather conditions tends to turn in gray shades, instead of the usual brown tones that we are generally glad to use. So keep in mind the context of your base to choose the colors you want to paint wood features. Now that the shed and fence are painted, I move to airbrush the vegetation colors using the Tamiya dark green 2 and yellow green. A first layer with dark green focus on the center and lower portions of grass and other plants, then move into lighter tones and airbrushing smaller areas on the top. I chose some plants to airbrush an overall lighter green to create color variation between different plant species, if I can say so. The terrain were painted with also Tamiya colors, ranging from red-brown and flat earth as base color to wooden deck tan and buff, highlighting more exposed areas. I prefer painting the terrain after the vegetation because I think it's more natural and realistic to have plants covered with dust than a dry road with greenish spots around grass, but this is just my opinion. The same black priming and airbrushed shades of green were applied to the branches. Back to the shed. The mortar was looking too light compared to the stones, so I applied a mix of burnt umber and black filter on it to tie everything together in a more balanced color. The mud on the pigs received some acrylic washes with burnt umber and dark brown, followed by a quick dry brushing with German camouflage pale brown to highlight the top texture and increase the depth perception. The loose stones on the road were also painted individually with shades of earth colors to highlight their presence on the scene and increase texture perception. Now moving to the paper plants. The base color was the airbrushed dark green, so I used Vallejo acrylics to make them more prominent, using light green on the leaves and a yellow-green to draw the leaf stem. It is far from the best paper plant, but the color scheme helped a lot to reduce the odd cutting shapes, making them look a bit thinner than they really are. The other paper plants were painted with wet blending to smooth color transitions. Yellow ochre was used to mimic dry leaves. I also dry brushed the top of the tall grass with yellow-green to bring more contrast and depth to the vegetation. Some spots on the sponge bushes were painted with light green and yellow to simulate new leaves and flowers. The base of the stone wall and the fence were painted with shades of green to simulate moisture and moss growing close to the ground and on shady areas. At this stage, I decided to add a bindweed to the shed. To make it, I grabbed a piece of polyfiber, painted it with dark brown, sprayed it with hairspray and sprinkled some Noch leaves of different shades of green. Then glued it in place with PVA glue. I decided for the hairspray instead of spray adhesive because the latter is quite strong and makes it difficult to handle the polyfiber without gluing it on itself, turning the fluffy appearance into a green slime. Well, moving ahead. An oil wash made of dark brown and sepia was applied on the tracks marks and also around some large stones on the ground. The pigsty also received a generous coat of this wash. A dark green wash was used on the mossy stones to bring some shadows again between the stones. Same to the fence, only with dark grey wash. As the shed looks a bit beaten up, I thought was missing some broken tiles on the floor, so I mixed plaster with mahogany and burnt umber and applied a coat over a piece of test and Diorama. It actually wasn't the best choice as the plaster stuck on the Diorama, making it a bit tricky to remove the dry plaster, but that was okay as I just wanted some broken pieces. Meanwhile, I added some fine turf on the mossy areas around the fence and the shed. I like the result pretty much, so I also added to some spots on the roof. The broken tiles were glued in place, taking care that they touch the ground through the grass and not float above it. So after fixation, a dark wash was applied to match the surrounding tone. The sponge moss was also painted with green shades, darker on the base and lighter at the top, using wet blending to get a nice and smooth color transition. The pig's mud effect was quite tricky. I didn't want to let everything with a clear coat and shiny layer, so I wanted to give the impression of water puddles here and there, so I used a brush with Tamiya smoke to fill the pig's footprints. While it dries, I applied a filter with dark green on the branches and the bindweeds to tone down the bright green of the leaves. After that, I painted the branches bark with a grayish brown as the base color, then painted random dots with deck tan, pale brown and dark umber to increase texture appearance. I was gifted with these 3D printed hams/chickens and 2 piglets, which will definitely add some life to the diorama. I started the painting with a black primer followed by a zenithal deck tan. The piglets were painted with base flesh skin and mahogany mix in thin layers. The chickens demanded a bit more effort. To give the impression of different feather colors, I intercalated some tiny brush strokes with light and dark reddish browns, overlaying the colors. Then I painted the small details like eyes, legs, beak and comb of the chickens. I really liked the result for the chickens, but the piglets were still missing something. They would be on the pigsty, so of course some mud and filthy were missing. With a small brush I painted the belly, legs and sides with dark brown and burnt umber, and the final touch was a thin dark brown wash. Talking about the pigsty, the shiny contrast of the clear smoke was too intense, so I gave another heavy layer of dark brown wash. I also added some speckling around the pig feeder and the wall right behind it. The oil wash gives a satin finish, but without completely killing the clear smoke effect, giving that moisture and wet look that I was looking for. With the same oils I painted some streaking grime effects on the stone wall, where I think some rainwater and moisture would run down through gaps between the stones. Now the creek. I don't have pouring resin, so my plan was to add only some puddles along the creek as some remaining rainwater. This was made with UV resin, mixed with a hint of burnt umber. However, as I was adding resin, I realized that the creek bed was almost in the same level, so I decided to make it full of running water. The ripples were made with glossy Mod Podge, and water effects with Vallejo off-white. One last filter of flat earth was airbrushed on the road and around the vegetation next to it, and also on the tank to tie everything together and give the final dust effect on it. That was missing since the painting video. Okay, time to add all the elements to the base, starting from Popeye. Well, Popeye, he looks like he's returning from the gym indisposed, but there's a reason for that, and you'll see in just a moment. While I wait him to get glue on the base, I add the piglets. One is quite interested in the tank that will be in front of it, and the other is looking for whatever there is of the base. One chicken crossed the road, right? No particular reason for that. The other one is waiting to see what happens. The branches were piled up on the road. Popeye is bringing them, waiting to begin tying it on the tank as camouflage. I also painted some dust on his trousers. Now you can understand why he looks so grumpy. He's been cutting wood all morning and dragging it from far away, but he's the man for the job. As you can see, he's holding a big branch with only 2 fingers. The last touch was to add some dust to the commander and gunner's boots and lower legs, and add a scratch-built headset to the commander's left hand. And that concludes the diorama. Finally! The whole project took much more time than I was expecting, but I'm really proud of the result. From the Jagdpanther assembling and painting, through all 3 figures sculpting and the base scratch building. I guess this was the best stone wall I made so far. The roof tiles problem was a back and forth procedure, until I found a good and simple solution, despite being a bit laborious, to not say something inappropriate here. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. It got quite long, but I felt that was important to go through all the process and effects, even in a fast-forward mode. So, hit the like button, it is super important for me to receive your support, and subscribe if you still don't or are new in the channel. So now, enjoy some more pictures of this diorama. Thanks a lot for your time. Cheers!